Hello again. One of the things that irritates me slightly about the video I made about the white slave trade is a number of comments that suggest that the transatlantic slave trade and the sufferings of black African slaves in Caribbean and the United States was worse than that of the white slaves in Africa and the Middle East. That's simply not true. I suppose there's two ways of measuring what might make the transatlantic slave trade worse. One is if it was a greater number of people suffering, and the other is if the cruelty and severity of their treatment was worse than that meted out to white slaves. Neither is true, and I haven't got time to go into all of this in just a short video. So let's concentrate today on the suffering of white slaves as opposed to the suffering and conditions of black slaves. And I want to look at two particular aspects of white slavery. The first is that many of the slaves captured in Europe and taken to North Africa, and some of them were taken to the Middle East, is that their fate was to end up as galley slaves. Now, I don't know if everybody here knows what galley slaves are or what galleys are even. Galleys are ships that are operated by oars. Typically you would have 250 men rowing, and each oar would have 3, 4 or 5 men pulling it. The conditions of the galley slaves were so atrocious. First, let's have a look. First, we'll look at some galleys to get an idea of what a galley was like in the 16th, 17th or 18th century, and then some photographs of galley slaves at work, and then we'll talk a little about their conditions. The conditions of the galley slaves were far worse than anything which you might have seen on a southern plantation in America or amongst slaves, black slaves in the Caribbean. As I say, there were about 250 rowers to each ship. Obviously, the only way that ship could work was if all the oars were being pulled simultaneously and every man was at his post. And to ensure that, the galley slaves were chained to their benches. They couldn't move at all. And when I say they couldn't move, I mean they couldn't move even to answer the call of nature. If someone wanted to open his bowels or empty his bladder, he had to do it where he was sitting. That's why the galley slaves didn't wear any clothes. They just sat there naked. If they needed a shit, they just went where they were sitting. Needless to say, there was no water for washing or anything of that sort. They were constantly working. It was back-breaking work. They were being whipped because whipping them was the only way to make them work. Their backs were absolutely covered in scars. It was dreadful business. They weren't unchained under any circumstances at all, not even to sleep, because there was always the risk of a slave revolt. So once those men were chained to their benches and chained to the oars, they stayed there for 5, 10, 20 years until they died. Most of them were worked to death. They did not leave the benches at all for any reason whatsoever. Now, because the bottom of that boat was literally awash with piss and shit, the stench was absolutely indescribable. Writers in the 16th century said, and it was almost certainly true, that you could smell a galley operated by slaves from over a mile away. I don't believe that any black slaves in the Americas had to endure such shocking conditions. I just want people to think for a moment about this. Can anybody give me an example of black slaves in the Caribbean kept in worse conditions than this, chained to one place for 20 years, whipped constantly, unable even to lay down to sleep? Okay, I want to look at another aspect now of slavery, white slavery in Africa and the Middle East, and that's the question of castration. Eunuchs are people that have had their penis and testicles removed. Here's a picture of a eunuch. Castration was very occasionally used on slaves in the Caribbean and in the United States. It wasn't a common practice, and it was usually undertaken as a punishment in response to an accusation of rape, for instance. The reason it wasn't commonly done was that, unless you're very careful, castration will kill a man, either from blood loss or surgical shock or infection afterward. And there's absolutely no point at all in killing slaves like that because they were expensive commodities. On white European slaves, though, castration was carried out on an industrial scale. There was a huge demand for eunuchs in the Ottoman Empire. The Quran forbids the mutilation and castration of slaves, as does the, it's specifically mentioned in the Hadith. So the Muslim countries preferred to buy slaves who'd already been castrated. Most were slaves. I think we've looked at the etymology of the word slave. It derives from the word for Slav. Most of the castrated slaves were Slavs. They were acquired by slavers in Russia and Ukraine, or the territories that are now Russia and Ukraine, and then brought to Europe to be castrated. There were special establishments, castration houses, which were based in cities such as Venice in Italy and Verdun in France. The Slavs were brought there, castrated, and then sold on to Muslim countries. Again, this is not something that the average black slave had to put up with. I'd be interested to hear, if people are going to make comments on this video, I'd like to see some specific examples, perhaps, of treatment of black slaves that was worse than that of galley slaves, or those that were routinely castrated for sale in Muslim countries. We'll look at the extent of white slavery in another video, but I can tell you from now that the number of white slaves was at least 10 or 20 times as many as the number of black slaves taken across the Atlantic.